Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am so glad you guys could join us for another episode of From the Collection. We are very excited to share some more interesting items from the Chapman Museum's collection with you today. And as a reminder, my name is Becca, and I'm the Program and Outreach Coordinator at the Chapman Museum.
And my name is Maureen, and I'm the curator at the Chapman.
And of course, we cannot forget the official mascot of the Chapman Museum, Zopher.
Well, hi, everyone. It's good to see you again.
So, Zopher, I have a question for you. Where do you live?
Really, Becca? That's an easy one. I live in Glens Falls. 348 Glen Street, to be exact.
All right, I know, that was too easy. But how about this one? When was Glens Falls officially chartered as a city?
1776?
Not quite, Zopher. But that's okay, because today we're going to be learning about the history of Glens Falls through two different objects in our collection.
So as a reminder, the Chapman Museum has lots of objects from the past stored in our archives and collection spaces. Some of these items are primary sources. A primary source is an object that was used or created by someone in the past. Primary sources can be letters, photographs, artifacts, clothing, speeches, and more. But we also have secondary sources stored in our collection. And a secondary source is an item or work that was created after a historical event. So, for example, a Wikipedia page on George Washington is considered a secondary source because the people who wrote that didn't really know Washington himself, and they weren't alive when he was. So some of the secondary sources in our collection at the museum include reference books, reproductions, or research files. Just like primary sources, secondary sources help people learn about the past.
Right. And as I said before, today we're going to be looking at two different objects from our collection. For each object, we're going to learn about what period in history it came from, what it was used for, and any other important information. And the objects we're looking at today relate to the history of Glens Falls. Our first object is a secondary source, and our second object is a primary source. Now, before we look at our objects, I want you to think about what you know about the history of Glens Falls. So take a minute, think about maybe the names of people associated with Glens Falls, important dates, names of places. And as always, if you need more time to think, you can always just pause the video. And now that you've given that question some thought, we're going to give you some historical context. Remember, historical context is like background information. It helps you and us better understand what was happening at the time those objects were being used. So our first object comes from the mid-1700s. And at that point in history, Glens Falls looked very different than it does now. The first people to live in the area were Native Americans, and these included the Mohicans, the Abenaki, and the Mohawk people. Native Americans lived in this area for thousands of years before the area became colonized by Europeans. They hunted for food, they fished, they traveled through, and they lived in what is now Glens Falls. Now, at the same time in the 1700s, European countries were claiming land in North America for themselves, even though there were already Native Americans living here. What they would do is they would send people from Europe to what they called the New World to build homes and businesses. And they called these places colonies. And the hope was that the colonies would help bring wealth and resources to Europe. Now, the country of England would eventually have 13 colonies, hopefully that's ringing a bell, along the eastern coast of what is now the United States. And France would have colonies in what is now Canada. Now, as always, I want to start with a map. Now, in our other episodes, the maps I showed you depicted the United States during a specific year or period in history. But this map, as you can see, is a little different. For one thing, it's just focused on New York State. And instead of showing cities or physical features like rivers or mountains, it's showing us the names of different Native American or indigenous peoples who lived in the state. Now, I've put a little red marker on that map where Glens Falls would be. And as you can see, three different Native American groups, the Mohicans, the Mohawks, and the Abenaki, would have lived, hunted, and traveled throughout the area. Now, in our other episodes, I've also shown a picture of the President of the United States during that period. But Native American tribes that lived in this region, they didn't have a president. Instead, they had a chief. And a chief was typically the leader of the tribe, and they helped make rules or decisions for their people. What's really unique about the Mohawk people, though, is that they are members of a group known as the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy. Hopefully you've heard of that term before. This was a group of 6 nations who joined together and promised to have peace, work together to resolve conflicts, and they served as allies to one another in times of war. An ally is like a friend or someone who will take your side or help you when you are in need. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy worked like a democracy in that each of the 6 nations had a voice or say. And this was actually an inspiration to people like Benjamin Franklin and the other founding fathers who used the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as a model for the United States Constitution. Pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
The Native American peoples who lived in New York State used the things in their environment to provide shelter, food, and clothing. The Mohicans and the Abenaki people lived in small, rounded structures called wigwams, while the Mohawks lived in very large, long structures called longhouses. You can see where the name comes from. Both wigwams and longhouses were made from trees and bark that were found in the woods around them. All 3 of these groups would have hunted animals like rabbits and deer, and they would have used their skin or fur for clothing. And they also used rivers like the Hudson and the Mohawk to fish and travel. Now, I want to share a different map, which shows you New York in the mid-1700s. Now, at this time, most of New York State was claimed as a colony of England, which you can see on the map. The ruler of the colony of New York was the King of England, and in 1762, which is the year we're going to be focusing on for our first object, the King of England was King George III. And hopefully he looks familiar to all of you at home because we talked about King George III in our very first episode, and he comes up a lot in history, particularly American history. So as I mentioned before, the point of a colony was to bring money to the European country that had founded that colony. For the colony of New York, this meant that resources such as furs, wheat, and fish would be sent to England, and then England would make money by selling those items. Now, another reason people sometimes moved to the colonies was to have religious freedom. In Europe, not everyone was allowed to practice their religion. By moving to the colonies, these people could worship the way they wanted without interference. New York is kind of special at this point because New York was known as being a very diverse and tolerant colony. Tolerance is putting up with or allowing something. And in this case, New York had religious tolerance, or they allowed people from many different religious and faith backgrounds to settle in their colony. So now that you have some historical context, it is time to look at our very first object. Maureen, would you do the honors?
Don't forget to put on gloves, Maureen! That way you can protect the object from the dirt and oils on your hands!
Thanks for that reminder, Zopher.
Very good, Zopher.
This object, I want you to think about what you notice. Think about the object's size, shape, color, the materials that it might be made out of. And if you want, you can pause the video and write down your observations.
All right, so Maureen's going to hold it up to the camera, get a really good look. Notice what it's made out of. Notice the size. Any other features that maybe look familiar to you or names that look familiar to you? Right.
One last look.
Yeah. And Zopher, if you would like to give us a drum roll, we'd appreciate it.
Right, our first object is a reproduction of a map of Queensbury in 1762.
Woo!
Maureen? That's a piece of paper.
Well, it's not just any sheet of paper, Zopher.
Exactly.
It's a reproduction of a map of Queensbury in 1762.
Yeah, you said that, but it's just a piece of paper with some boxes drawn on it. It's nothing cool like a fire engine toy or a surgical kit.
All right, well, it might not look very exciting to you, Zopher, but this piece of paper is really important to the founding of Glens Falls.
Really? How?
Well, in 1762, a man named Abraham Wing was deeded the Queensbury patent. A land patent is a legal document that gives a person permission to own a piece of land. So in this case, Abraham Wing was given permission to own and settle what is now Glens Falls and Queensbury. So the patent is dated May 1762, and the patent was granted by King George III.
There's that name again.
It was named Queensbury after his wife, Queen Charlotte, who he'd married just the year before.
What? The Queen Charlotte? The one from Bridgerton?
The very one.
Oh.
You watch Bridgerton, Zopher?
Dearest gentle reader, well, the missus is the one who watches it, but sometimes I catch a scene or two.
Wait. Hold up. The missus? You're married?
Oh, yeah! Her name's Catherine.
Oh. Zopher? Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I hope we get to meet Catherine one day. Now, Maureen, what else can you tell us about this map?
Well, all these boxes on it that you can see represent different land plots. So when Abraham Wing first arrived here, he surveyed the land. This means he measured out the distance between different points, marked where geographic features like rivers, streams, or mountains were located. And the land from the Queensbury patent was divided into these smaller sections. And each section or plot got a number. And eventually, when more people moved to the area, they settled on these plots of land where they built homes, businesses. One of the first buildings constructed was Wing's Tavern, which is located on what is now the corner of Ridge and Warren Street. Wing's Tavern served as a store and an inn for people to stay at. It was a place for people to gather where they could listen to the news, they could discuss it,
And just hang out.
Yeah.
So, why did Mr. Wing choose this area to settle in?
There are probably many different reasons why Mr. Wing or Abraham Wing decided to settle here. For one thing, as I'm sure you're aware, Zopher, the area has lots of natural resources, things that are naturally occurring. There was food to eat, like fish and deer. There were tons of trees that could be chopped down and used for making buildings. There was the actual falls that Glens Falls is named for that could provide power to mills. And Glens Falls is right on the Hudson River. In colonial America, rivers were really important because they allowed people to travel more easily and to ship goods to places. And then as a Quaker...
What's that?
Well, the Quakers are a religious group, Zopher, and one of their core beliefs is pacifism. And this means that they reject war or violence to solve their problems. But in the 1700s, many Quakers were looking for a place to live where they'd be able to practice their religion, including that pacifism, freely. And if you remember, Zopher, New York was a really tolerant colony. They accepted people from all different faiths and religious backgrounds. So for a Quaker, New York might have been a good place to settle.
I'm glad Mr. Wing realized that Glens Falls was a nice place to live. I'm surprised about one thing, though. Why didn't he name the area after himself? If it were me, I would name it Zopher Falls.
Well, that's a really funny story, Zopher. See, originally the area was known as Wings Falls. Abraham named it after himself. But unfortunately, Abraham Wing got into some debt. Debt is when you owe money to someone. Now, supposedly, a man named Johannes Glenn, offered to pay off Wing's debt if in return the name of the area was changed to Glens Falls. Wing agreed, and the name was changed.
Really?
Well, there are a couple different stories about how the name change came to be, but historians think that one is the most accurate.
I guess that map isn't boring after all, Maureen.
I'm glad you feel that way, Zopher.
All right, now on to our next object, which also relates to the city of Glens Falls. But first, we're going to give you a little more historical context before we show you that object. So while Glens Falls started out as a small settlement, as the years passed, it began to grow. I mentioned before how there was plenty of natural resources in the area, and people began to move to the area to take advantage of those resources. Eventually, enough people lived in the area for Glens Falls to be called a village. Now, in the 1800s, several different industries began to pop up in Glens Falls. An industry is a group of businesses that make or sell similar products or perform similar services. In this area, there was the lumber industry, which would cut down trees and they could be turned into boards to build houses or other buildings. There was the cement industry, which would make and ship cement. There was the paper industry, which I'm sure, as you can guess, made paper. And then there was the textile industry, which made cloth and clothing. Now, people began moving to Glens Falls to work in these industries. And throughout the 1800s, the village of Glens Falls began to grow. More and more people and businesses began to move to the area. And then in 1908, something big happened. But before we tell you what happened, we're going to look at the year 1908, kind of on a broader scale. So in 1908, the United States looked pretty much the way it does now, except we were missing a few states. Arizona, New Mexico, Alaska, and Hawaii were not yet states in 1908. And you can see on the map that these future states are in gray. Now, the president of the US at this time was Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore, or Teddy, was from New York, and he was known for his big personality, which matched some big changes that were happening in the United States at that time. Theodore Roosevelt was president during an era in US history known as the Progressive Era. During the Progressive Era, people worked hard to make laws that protected people in the jobs they worked at, the food they ate, and the rights they had. So, for example, it's during the Progressive Era that laws were passed that required children to go to school instead of having to work, and white women were granted the right to vote. And while that was happening across the country, a big change was also happening right here in Glens Falls, which brings us to our second object. Maureen, will you do the honors? All right.
Absolutely. Here's our second object.
Ooh.
I'm going to move it a little closer.
Yeah.
So you can see the front of that.
Yeah, very important to notice that front. And again, you're going to look at the object's size, its shape, color, materials. And you're also going to notice some etching on the front of the object. So as you're looking at it, read that text, see if you notice anything familiar about that etching on there. And again, take some time to think about what you noticed. You can always pause the video and write down your observations. All right, Maureen, this object is?
This object is a glass from the inauguration of City Hall in 1908.
Huh.
That big event that Becca mentioned earlier was the village of Glens Falls officially being incorporated as a city. And this means that Glens Falls was so big and so wealthy and so many people were living here now that New York State decided that Glens Falls should become a city. And if you look closely, you might even recognize a familiar location.
You notice anything, Zopher?
Yeah, get nice and close, Zopher.
Yeah.
Is that City Hall?
It is. The building that is now City Hall was built in 1900 and it was called Village Hall. After Glens Falls became a city in 1908, the name was changed to City Hall.
Makes sense.
So this glass was probably given out or purchased as a souvenir in celebration of that event.
So remember, Zopher, when I asked you when Glens Falls was officially chartered as a city? Well, here's your answer. The charter to officially make Glens Falls a city was signed on Friday, March 13th, 1908.
Friday the 13th? Were they crazy?
Well, some people were worried and they thought they should push it back a day or so. But in the end, they went ahead with the signing. Now, the man who signed the charter was named Charles Evan Hughes. Hughes was born in Glens Falls, and he had actually become the governor of New York State in 1907, just a year before. So he's the one who gets to sign that Glens Falls is officially a city. Pretty cool when he was actually born here. The news that Glens Falls was officially a city was wired or telegraphed to Glens Falls, and to celebrate, the people in the city, they blew whistles, they rung bells, and they waved flags because they were so excited that Glens Falls was officially a city.
I guess it wasn't such an unlucky date after all. So what happened after that?
Well, just like any city, Glens Falls continued to grow and change through the years. And in 2008, the city actually celebrated its centennial or 100th birthday.
Wait a minute. That makes Glens Falls 117?
Yep, but Glens Falls history goes back even further than that. There have been a lot of different people who have lived here over the years. And as I mentioned before, Native Americans lived and hunted in the area long before it was called Glens Falls. And many others have come through since then, all the way up till today. All right, well, that is all for today's episode. Thanks again for joining us, everyone. And of course, thanks to you, Zopher. And thank you to Maureen, of course, for sharing some more interesting items from our collection. And now that you've learned a little bit about some of the objects in our collection here at the Chapman Museum, we want you to create a piece of art that incorporates one of the objects discussed today. So you can draw a picture, you can write a story, you can come up with a song or a poem or something we didn't even think of, and you can send your art to me at educator@chapmanmuseum.org, along with your first name, and it might just be featured on our social media pages. All right. Well, thank you to everyone at home for joining us today. We hope to have more episodes of From the Collection in the future. So make sure you keep an eye out on our museum website and our social media pages. And until then, have a great day, keep on learning, and make sure you visit us at the museum. We have tons of cool stuff.